Yes, exactly. Thank you, Marie Gabrielle. So we are now recording our session. Yes, and I will just introduce our first speaker today, who is Jesus Mendieta Ugarte. He is here in Puebla. He's a student at the History College of this very institute here, the Benemérita Universidade Autónoma de Puebla. And Mendieta Ugarte will give a talk in Spanish, right? Titled A Problem with Time, the Globality, the Existence, and the Conception of Historicity. So I will give now the word to you, Jesus, and then I will introduce the other speakers following the order of our program. So the word is yours. Thank you very much for being here. Yeah, you can see, it's true. You can sit here so people can follow you in the camera.
Thank you.
All right.
Good morning for all. Thank you for listening. ¿No? Voy a hablar en español. Me siento más cómodo para plantear los problemas que aquí nos aquejan. Bueno, mi tema tiene que ver con la globalidad como un problema del tiempo presente, además de la existencia y de los distintos trabajos que se han hecho en los últimos años en revistas académicas, tanto en Estados Unidos, en Europa, en América Latina y en particular en Brasil, con trabajos que tienen que ver desde el tiempo, bueno, desde la historia del tiempo presente y además de los estudios de la historia global, que es con una de las dos conjeturas que quiero analizar y me interesa presentar en esta conferencia. En primer lugar, pues es importante plantear qué es globalidad desde el punto sociológico, histórico, antropológico que se ha descrito en los últimos años en América Latina en particular. Por ejemplo, uno de los trabajos que más han tenido impacto en la zona sur de América Latina, en Brasil en particular, ha sido el del pensador Octavio Yanni, con la era del globalismo. Es un trabajo de los años 90 que tiene un enfoque particular con las ciencias sociales, en particular con las cuestiones de la comunicación. En los distintos trabajos que han descrito a este académico ha sido que ha trabajado el tema muy en particular en economía, con respecto a los estados, al crecimiento de la dependencia de América Latina, la dependencia de los estados nacionales en América Latina después de la dictadura, el renacer de las democracias y el pensar cómo está el tiempo presente, ¿no? El trauma, cómo se repiensa, por ejemplo, el tema de la comunicación, el tema de la lengua, pero principalmente el sentido de la experiencia del tiempo. Porque no es lo mismo hablar del tiempo humano, vivencial, social, que el tiempo escrito, cosas que por ejemplo lo vamos a retomar en Koselleck, en John Rusen y en François Hartog. Es importante estos escritos porque dan un análisis con respecto a lo que pasa en Europa, a lo que se escribe en Europa, en Estados Unidos, con, por ejemplo, un texto de John Samito que plantea hoy el renacer del presentismo, pero particularmente con el tiempo de las crisis. De igual momento, pues, por ejemplo, estamos con los nuevos trabajos que han planteado Dipesh Chakrabarty con Anthropoceno Time y el de Capitaloceno de Jason Moore. Y estos trabajos han sido muy importantes en los últimos años debido al impacto que han tenido y al análisis que han hecho con respecto, pues, al auge del capital, al auge del capitalismo, y cómo esto se vincula con, pues, la iterabilidad, el tema de las cuestiones, los discursos que son capaces de repetirse, y pues aparte de los textos, cómo las sociedades mismas crean y refuerzan estos discursos. Por lo tanto, el presentismo tiene una gran carga, pues, de recuerdo, de trauma con los discursos que se tienen en América Latina en particular. En Brasil ha habido trabajos muy importantes y una recepción importante, rica, a Koselleck. Por ejemplo, tenemos los trabajos de Breno Méndez, tenemos trabajos de Octavio Yanni, de José Carlos Herraiz y del mismo modo de Walderez Ramalho, que aquí lo tenemos presente, ¿no? Y es importante estos trabajos porque precisamente describen y nos podemos adentrar, nos muestran cómo ha sido la recepción, ¿no? Y cómo ha sido el estudio del tiempo presente, de los tiempos, de las crisis, el análisis a la historia del tiempo, pero principalmente se han adentrado como historiadores, ¿no?, al análisis de cómo se escribe el tiempo, cómo se tendría que escribir el tiempo en el siglo XXI. François Hartog mencionaba que con esta propuesta del tiempo podemos no solamente pensar qué historia se puede hacer o qué se tendría que hacer, sino qué historia ya no se puede hacer. Hoy se hablaba, bueno, en la primera mitad del siglo XX se planteaba los ciclos largos, ¿no? Desde la economía económica, desde el planteamiento económico, desde la sociología, desde la antropología, y se dejaba en fuera por parte de la historia porque se pensaba que era un tema filosófico, un tema en donde se tenía que repensar más allá, precisamente con la hermenéutica, con las ideas hermenéuticas que venían pues, de la gran escuela alemana. Bueno, durante ya la segunda mitad del siglo XX podemos ver cómo se ha cambiado estos ejemplos, ¿no? Estos casos donde los historiadores se meten en el tema, se crean institutos como en Francia, que alrededor de los años 70 se crea el Instituto del Tiempo Presente, y también esto cómo adentra a ver, por ejemplo, cómo se van formando los historiadores en América Latina. Por ejemplo, me ha interesado por eso el tema de Brasil, porque es uno de los puntos donde más ha tenido recepción esta teoría, ¿no? En México se ha tenido, solamente que no se ha trabajado tanto de forma transdisciplinar como se ha hecho en Brasil. Por ejemplo, aquí tenemos el caso de Carlos Aguirre Rojas, tenemos el caso de Cristian Sperling, académicos que han trabajado el tema de Koselleck y son los introductores y traductores del tema, ¿no? Pues con esto me interesa también plantear lo del tema de la existencia, que es hacia dónde va la historia y hacia dónde va el humano con estos temas. ¿Qué nuevos actores políticos y historiográficos tenemos gracias al planteamiento de los académicos como Dipesh Chakrabarty, de Walderez Ramalho, de Octavio Yanni, de George Amito, de Daniel Killeman, porque plantean conjeturas críticas que son para replantearse constantemente hoy, por ejemplo, cómo se repiensan los estados coloniales, los estados postcoloniales, cómo se repiensa la crisis humanitaria, la crisis del planeta, la crisis climática. Esto ha entrado mucho en cuestión Jason Moore, ¿no? Y esto es importante porque plantea, por un lado, cómo se viven estas conjeturas con la sociedad, por ejemplo, desde abajo, con comunidades, con académicos, con gobiernos, estados, pero al mismo tiempo cómo se van repensando para analizarse a corto, mediano y largo plazo. Estos temas, por ejemplo, han estado trabajando Zoltán Simon, junto con Daniel Killeman, que han tratado de ver esto después de los años 80, que vemos el presentismo que trabaja Hartog, y ahora ya sin las ideologías, sin la actualidad de los discursos, ¿no?, políticos del pasado, pero que se van repensando, que se van reestructurando para una nueva reformulación del tema, ¿no? Por ejemplo, tenemos el tema de hoy la idea de la postguerra fría, ¿no?, donde se plantea el regreso de las viejas ideologías, donde se va repensando el papel del Estado, de los estados, de las ideas y las ideas de la humanidad, ¿no?, como las ideas antagónicas. Pues me interesa terminar para darle más oportunidad a mis compañeros panelistas. Solamente terminaría que uno de los trabajos que más han replanteado sobre el tema de la globalidad del tiempo y la existencia han sido precisamente los brasileños como Breno Mendes, como el de Walderez Ramalho, como el de Giovanni Cappadocia en Estados Unidos, como el de John Samito, y pues de revistas académicas que nos ayudan precisamente a entender más en este tipo de encuentros la forma transdisciplinar y internacional, por ejemplo, el trabajo de historia de la historiografía en Brasil, la revista Tempo, la revista History and Theory en Estados Unidos, y los diferentes dosieres y artículos que se van escribiendo en Francia con el Instituto del Tiempo Presente, en España y en México, pues como he dicho, pues ha crecido este tipo de planteamientos, pero hace falta más el estudio, pues la recepción y el estudio de los trabajos por ejemplo, en América Latina, en Brasil, en Argentina y en Estados Unidos para dar una mayor riqueza al tema, al planteamiento. Muchas gracias. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much, Jesus, for your nice presentation, good talk. And now I suggest to proceed. The next speaker today is the Professor María Inés la Greca. It's very nice to see you and interacting with you again, María Inés. María Inés is an assistant researcher at the National Council for Scientific and Technical Research, CONICET, and Associate Professor of Gender Epistemology at the Universidad Nacional Três de Fevereiro, sorry for my accent, in Argentina. She also teaches philosophy of history at the University of Buenos Aires, at the philosophy department. And her current research interests include theory of history, feminist theory and history, narrativity, performativity, embodiment, and the theory of subject formation. And then, today María Inés will present a paper with the title Social Movements as History Mediators, Some Reflections from Argentina on Feminism 99%, a Manifesto. So I'll give the word to you now, María Inés. Thank you very much for being here today.
Thank you, Valdemar. Thank you, everybody. It's really nice to be part of the conference. I am really sad that I wasn't able to be there due to the whole difficulty with traveling and the pandemic and planning for the future, but I'm very happy that we are restarting to meet and to talk again with the wonderful people that meet every 2 years, I hope, again, in this conference. I want to make a comment in Spanish. Para quienes no entienden inglés o por ahí entienden menos, yo decidí hablar en inglés porque la conferencia es internacional, pero puedo facilitar un borrador de mi texto en español si es difícil seguir la presentación en inglés, así que existe la posibilidad, si les interesa, de que se los comparta. I was just saying that I would share a Spanish draft because I decided to talk in English because the conference is international, and even if we can debate about it, English is our lingua franca in academia. Okay, so I'm going to share a PowerPoint. I'll try to do it now. Let me know if I'm doing it correctly.
Yes, you can share through Zoom.
Yes, I'll do that. Okay.
Yes, it's working. Okay, now you can see if you put it on the if you put it in the presentation mode. Yes, perfect.
Okay, so should I start?
Yes.
Okay. Well, so the present paper aims at asking the question and given the idea.
Yes. María Inés, sorry, excuse me. Sorry for interrupting you. Can you, I don't know, maybe.
No.
Yeah, your volume is a little bit low. Can you just try to increase the volume?
Speak louder?
Yeah, or speak a little bit louder.
Okay, because I am doing nothing with the volume, so.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Now it's better, right? Yes, now it's better.
Okay.
Now it's better. Thank you very much.
If not, I can try to find some headphones. But
no, it's good now. Thank you.
It's okay?
Yes.
Okay. If there is any technical problem, don't worry and interrupt me because I would like to be.
All right.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much.
Okay. So I was saying, thank you, Anastasia, also in the chat. I was saying that my aim today is to ask the question if we can consider social movements as history mediators. And I'm going to be working on a specific case and making my point through this case. So I am very interested in seeing and hearing what you think about it. So in the face of current international feminist and LGBTQ+ protests, what relationship can be established between the massive demonstrations against gender violence and femicide and in favor of women and LGBTQ plus people human rights, and the idea of the mediation of history. And what does mediating history means here? Sorry, I'm having a problem with the PowerPoint. If you can give me a moment. Okay, here. So this presentation argues the following, that social movements can be history mediators when the articulation of their demands challenge hegemonic narratives that legitimate the social status quo. That challenge aims at undermining the authority of hegemonic narratives, but it can also affect revision and re-narration of our assumptions about history and the very terms by which society understands itself. In this sense, social movements as history mediators propose, in my opinion, a practical path to face present urgent political matters. However, I have written about this, and I can develop this if there is any question. I do not understand the practical past, a notion by Hayden White, as opposed in a dichotomical way to the historical past. The case of current feminist movement combines in a cognitive responsible way the practical and the historical interest in the past. So, a practical path for international feminism is the title I give to the publication of this text that is a manifesto. It was titled Feminism for the 99%, a manifesto. It was published in March 8th, 2019 in the context of the third International Women's Strike. It was written by Cynthia Rusa, Titi Bhattacharya, and Nancy Fraser. They are both academics working mainly in the New School for Social Research in New York, but also activists and part of the International Women's Strike. This text was simultaneously published in 14 languages, and there the authors call on all radical movements to join together in a common anti-capitalist insurgency. Inspired by the previous two strikes, they dedicate this book, this manifesto, to the Combahee River Collective, that is, it has a famous manifesto from the 70s, and today to, I am quoting, the Polish and Argentine feminist strikers who are breaking new ground today. So there is a narrative in the manifesto, and it is the following one. It presents a political diagnosis after 4 decades of neoliberalism, and it says that we are witnessing another form of the inherent contradiction in capitalism, that between the production of profit and the reproduction of social life. More precisely, that there is a cannibalization of the conditions for food, healthcare, housing, education, pensions, and so on. We are then in a critical situation where human survival is at stake as the result of the neoliberal capitalist predatory form of production. They believe that Polish and Argentine feminist strikers since 2016 have produced a redefinition of our idea of the strike insofar as the notion of labor that they have is broader. The activities that are stopped by the strike are not just the traditional understood paid labor, but also, at the same level of relevance, the unpaid labor that sustains the reproduction of life, the task of caregiving and housework that are undertaken by women, LGBTQ plus people, migrants, and racialized people mostly. Hence, they call to action feminist and non-feminist radical movements around the world to articulate their struggles to defend the community from neoliberalism and to make room for a new social order. So there is a subject of this narrative or history, and this would be international feminism and radical activists that have a chance to become, I'm quoting from the manifesto, a non-homogeneous, plural and diverse subject of history, an alliance that takes our difference seriously, or also, this is called a new open-ended universalism, that is, I'm quoting, always information, always open to transformation and contestation, and always establishing itself anew through solidarity. between, again, feminists, LGBTQ plus people, migrants, indigenous people, anti-racist, ecological, and other radical activists. So now I want to go from south to north. You remember that I said that this manifesto was dedicated to the Polish and Argentinian feminist strikers. So from Argentina, I want to remember that there is a current massive social movement of feminism since 2015. I'm talking about 4 years before the publication of the manifest and 2 years previous to the first international women's strike. So we have an international feminism and international women's strikes since 2017. Later in Argentina, these strikes are going to be called, or there's going to be a discussion to call them women, lesbian, trans, travestis, and non-binary people. This will be relevant ahead. I'm putting the word travesti and not transvestite because there is a difference in meaning in the Argentinian political use of this term. I can also comment on that later. So in Argentina, we have a return, we will say, or a redeployment of feminism as a massive social movement since 2015. This was the protagonism of this reemergence of feminism had to do with the Ni Una Menos movement, collective hashtag. I'm using all these words because it started by being a call from a group of journalists, artists, activists to manifest again femicide and gender violence, and it ended up being a kind of collective movement, or also an international hashtag that would also have impact in different parts of Latin America and on the world where there are different Ni Una Menos or not one less groups. This was June 3rd, 2015, and it impacted into a massive protest all across the country that was a quite spontaneous one, where a lot of people that didn't consider themselves feminist or part of the women's movement, etc., went to the street and started being mobilized by this kind of demands. So initially it was against gender violence and femicide, but it then started demanding that making visible the issues of gender and sexuality, inequality, violence, and discrimination in the country. So this had a great impact in mass media, social media, the public agenda. For example, politicians had to start talking about gender or femicide or claiming what they were going to do about that to win an election, for example, political debates, and an impact also in institutions and academia. And this also involved later the public and massive demand of legal abortion that was a struggle that was being taken up from several feminists for the past, I don't know, 4 or 3 decades, but that didn't have the audience or the massive company of the population to be really heard. And finally, in December 2020, the legal abortion law passed. That was a very important event in Latin America. Only Uruguay previously had legal abortion, and also with the strong Christian and Catholic origin or culture in Latin America, it was really a very important political event. So what I wanted to show is that there was already some political organization, massive feminism, and this had to do with going into strike. First, on a national level in 2016, something similar happened in Poland a couple of weeks previously to the national strike in Argentina. In Poland, it had to do with the impulse of the right-wing party or part of the society to get to forbid again the free abortion law that there was or rights that were secured previously in Poland. But in Argentina, we also found a series of manifestos of public statements. And in the case of this collective, Ni Una Menos, that had a very relevant voice during these years, the kind of statement they made in social media, in the massive protest where there was a moment of reading the statement, etc., they edited a volume that included the public statement from 2015 to 2018 that it was called Amistad Política, Inteligencia Colectiva, Political Friendship, Collective Imagination. In that edited volume that was published some months before the Feminism for the 99% Manifesto, in the prologue of that edited volume that was written 3 years after the beginning of the whole feminist movement, we can find, in effect, similarities in the diagnosis of the other manifesto from the feminism of the 99%, with the difference that the US manifesto has a full-blown showed where the different public statements from Ni Una Menos were written on different moments and context, so there is not a full-blown narrative, but there are similarities in the diagnosis. And we found there, for example, in the prologue that has an overview of the process, again, also an affirmation of a process of political subjectivation as part of the appearance of an international feminist movement today. We also find in some of those public statements that are calls to strike, telling people to be part of the feminist strikes, the signature in the different signatures at the end of the declarations of the International Women's Strike were the authors of the US manifesto are also part. And I am also interested in showing that there was another text that is interesting, and it was written by one of the important voices of this Ni Una Menos collective during this year, that is by María Pía López. It was published in the same year as the Feminism of 99% Manifesto, and it was called Apuntes para las Militancias, Feminismos, Promesas y Combates, that we can translate as Notes for Activisms, Feminism, Promises and Battles. And what I want to show, here's the moment where I'm trying to put forward my hypothesis about how social movements can be social mediators and how this social mediation can be understood in terms of a cognitive responsible way of mediating history. So we saw that there was a claim in the Argentine declaration or manifestos of a process of subjectivation going on. But then we move in this later text from María Pía López, that is more a reflection on the issue, to the question of the name of the historical subject. Remember that I said that in the 99% manifesto, there was a reflection on an open-ended universalism that took differences seriously, etc. And that part of the manifesto was not part of the thesis of the manifesto, but the postface of the manifesto. So like a complementary reflection on what the manifesto claimed. In this text I'm going to read, that is from María López's text in Argentina in 2019 as part of the reflection of the 4 previous years of feminism developing in the streets, we have this reflection that for me
sorry, Marilis, to interrupt you. We lost your...
I am going to quote. When we say women, yes?
Sorry. Now you're back, because for a minute we lost your sound, but now you're back. So if you can repeat.
Okay, what was the last thing you heard from me?
The last sentence.
Huh?
The last.
Yeah, only the very last sentence. So you were speaking about this.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, so I'll rephrase briefly. What I'm now presenting is a paragraph from the text by María Pía López that is not a manifesto, but a reflection for activism, and that presents for me the question as a problem and as a question to us over the name of the historical subject that we are trying to trace from the 99 manifesto and the Argentinian ones. So I'm going to quote, "We know that when we say women, we are naming a political construction that includes lesbian, travestis, and trans people. Women is the quicker name of our public appearance, but at the same time that we use it, we put it on the verge of explosion for it to show what it entails and what it conceals. Trans feminisms have taught us through the public appearance of their bodies that everybody is a political construction and that to take charge of our own, we have to deconstruct it. Even when gender is associated to a biological origin, to know that no one is born women, that we are produced as such, but that we also produce ourselves when we give ourselves a voice and a discourse, when we demand recognition and respect, when we won't get back to the prison house of womanhood as a given identity. That is not enough for us." End of quote. So here is what I think I can propose you to consider, that there is a notion of historical subject being mediated in this social movement, and this notion of the historical subject is being refigured as embodied social existence. So in the 99% Manifesto, we saw that there was, they were talking about an articulation of alliances between feminists and radical activists, again, the one I have mentioned previously, and that this is possible given the redefinition of the strike that has highlighted how certain social groups suffer the attack on social reproduction that, I am quoting from the 99% Manifesto, encompasses activities that sustain human beings as embodied social beings who must not only eat and sleep, but also raise their children, care for their families, and maintain their communities, all while pursuing their hope for the future. These people-making activities occur in one form or another in every society. So this is the part of the conclusion of my presentation. I hope that I have been clear, and I'm willing to answer any objection or question. I think that what we find here is a kind of, I'm sorry, I am not seeing the presentation. Okay. It's a kind of hesitation to name this historical subject, but this has to do with the cognitive responsibility that the movement evinces. Because what we can see in this reflection on the subjects of history is the critical perspective gained on identity categories that is a perspective that has been built from 5 decades of activism and academic reflection. So in the Argentine manifestos and in Maria Pia Lopez's text, we saw that there was a displacement and hesitation to name this subject. From women to women, lesbian, travesti, trans, non-binary people, and then, I cannot present it, but you can check it, it moves to feminized bodies, rebellious bodies, non-conforming bodies, dictating bodies, bodies territories, to name this subjectivation, this kind of historical subject. And the name women is considered a political construction and a deconstruction to be done. From women to sexuality and gender issues, they move to notions of bodies, political freedom. And in the 99 Manifesto, we have the same case in the post-phase, where they call to action from the feminist point of view, but they have to acknowledge that feminism is not equivalent to all radical struggle. Thus, this feminism is striving to talk about an open-ended new universalism, taking our difference seriously and building robust alliances, but they cannot claim exclusively to identify feminism solely with women or gender issues. So my point finally is that what we can see is that there is a way of understanding who is the subject of history, or who are the subjects of history, who are the subject of this moment of protest and political action that cannot avoid, because this has to do with the redevelopment of feminism. They cannot avoid talking about women or gender issues, but they cannot reduce the issue on that. And because the issue has to do with the attack on social reproduction, there is a heightened notion of embodied existence or embodied social existence that is being placed as a basic aspect of our experience and our lives that we should take into account when we understand history, not only as a narration, but also as historical, as a moment of change. Well, that will be all. I hope I was clear about it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Maria Inés, for your very thought-provoking talk. Yeah, quite sure that we're gonna discuss very much later on. I don't see Maria Gabriela is already showing the participants. I don't see Carlos Gordillo in here. All right, so he's not here. So I will just follow the program, and then I will just introduce our next speaker, who is Lisa Regazzoni, who will present a work entitled The Intentionality of Evidence and the Elementary Particles of Historicity. I hope this is indeed the updated version of your title, right, Elisa? Okay, now I can see. All right. Well, I will just introduce her next speaker. Lisa Regazzoni is, I hope I'm pronouncing it well, is a professor of theory of history at the University of Bielefeld. She studied philosophy at the Universities of Bologna and Heidelberg, and earned a PhD in philosophy at the University of Potsdam in 2006. And well, after several fellowships in Paris, London, and Princeton, she qualified as a professor of modern history at the Goethe University in Frankfurt in 2019. And among her many publications, I would highlight two books. The first is Selection and Catalog, The Construction of the Past in Homer, Dante, and Primo Levi from 2008. And Themes of History, Gallic Past and French Historical Research in the 18th and early 19th century, from a book from 2020. Lisa Regazzoni is also one of the co-founders of the blog Theory of History at Work, which most of us are very familiar, and which was launched in September 2021, last September. So, Professor Lisa, I give the word to you now. You may begin, please. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you so much for your gracious presentation and the opportunity to present to you some reflection about my own ongoing project. And I'm very sorry not to be in Puebla. It was not possible, but I hope I will meet you in the future several times. So the irony of history can manifest itself in many ways. One is when efforts to pass on testimonies of past or present events are shattered by future generations and their critique of these testimonies. The future will most likely reinterpret, amend, or invalidate them with alternative evidence. We know how this works. The Roman history of classical authors, such as Caesar and Livy, for instance, was subjected to harsh criticism in the early modern period. It was considered unreliable due to the alleged partisan or apologetic motives it pursued. This critique was accompanied by the emergence of historiographies of pre-Roman indigenous peoples, such as the Gauls and Germans. Another example is the statue of Edward Colston, erected in Bristol in 1895 to commemorate his philanthropic activity, was toppled into Bristol Harbor 2020 as a reminder of his role as a slave trader. The history of immigration of various tribes to former territories of the Western Roman Empire has been rewritten by genetic history. The later, based on the new method of sequencing historical DNA from the bones of the deceased, led to a new conceptualization of these historical subjects. The dialectic anticipates the inevitable fate of any attempt to impose on future generations testimonies that are endowed with a specific meaning. But it's precisely this dialectic that allows us to think of history as open, that is, as contestable, revisable, and rewritable. In other words, if we want to contest history as it is passed down, then we must accept that future generations have the right to reject our offer of meaning about what will be their past. The emotional undertone of this freedom to revise and reinterpret is distrust. It is a skepticism towards any account or representation of the past that has come into the present. These are likewise suspected of more or less consciously serving certain authorities, powers, funders, value systems, or simply some academic fashion or opportunism. This sense of distrust is in turn a historical phenomenon. At least as far as European historiography is concerned, it referred to historical accounts and representations that were handed down and to the authorities that vouched for their validity. This skepticism gradually became palpable in the period conventionally known as the early modern age. The most powerful epistemological response to this is historical critique, a tool that continues to be the basis of historical research to this day. Historical critique, first of all, means verifying the authenticity of the sources. Secondly, it refers to assessing the reliability of source content and subsequent narratives. Thirdly, it allows historians not only to amend sources and revise narratives, as in the case of Roman history, it can also reverse history, as in the example of the Colston statue. In sum, following my analysis of the epistemology of historiography since the early modern age, have reached the conclusion that this distrust of sources and of intentionally transmitted accounts goes hand in hand with the emergence of an open past. Freedom to reject a prefabricated past, freedom to formulate new historical questions, and render the past an open space for re-examination. Distrust, but also the freedom to ask the past new questions dictated by the pressures of the present, had a second fundamental epistemological consequence. The emergence of new category of evidence, the so-called unintentional evidence. Johann Gustav Treusen referred to it as Überreste, remains, that is, involuntary testimonies to the past. Almost 100 years later, Marc Bloch would call it témoins malgré eux, witnesses despite themselves. This unintended evidence consists of material or immaterial media acknowledged as unwitting and unintended bearers of information about the past. The early modern age offers numerous examples of this epistemic operation. Think of the prehistoric lithic tools and everyday objects that were gradually invested with new historical meaning. They were seen as evidence of the cultural history of certain ethnic groups. Think of languages and dialects spoken by contemporaries and used to trace the history of human migrations, of the different shapes of Greek and Latin characters used as clues to the dating and geographical origin of manuscripts. Monuments intentionally erected to the perennial memory of events or personalities, for instance, were now being examined as unintentional and indirect witnesses of other historical areas of interest, such as the history of metalwork techniques, artistic styles, or customs. Today, the list could be extended to include the emergence of new kinds of unintended witnesses, such as DNA or plastic microparticles in geological strata. Conspicuous here is that the concept of unintended evidence corresponds to an epistemological rather than an ontological reality. In fact, evidence of this kind is nothing more than items or entities that exist in our present, such as account books, urns, or human remains. Historians have invested these items with a historical and gnosiological value. From time to time, they have been qualified as written, material, and organic sources. That is, indirect and metonymic traces of a moment of other duration that we place in the past. Unintended evidence is also invested with a positive epistemic value. It is inasmuch as it is unintentional, it is of course impartial, objective, and disinterested. As a result of my reconstruction and my historical and epistemological analysis of this unintentional evidence, the category of intentionality or non-intentionality emerges as pivotal to the idea of historical critique. This is still valid today. Intentionality is a category that remains implicit, but in my view continues to play a key role in how we construct history, how we think about history, and how we research history. So much for historical reconstruction. Currently, I'm working on a general critique of intentionality, which involves analyzing this category in terms of historical evidence. Critique should be understood in this context in the Kantian sense of analysis or reflective examination, and in the sense of revision. The concept of intentionality is in turn understood in the phenomenological sense. John Searle tells us that intentionality is that feature of the mind by which mental states are directed at, or are about, or of, or refer to, or aim at states of affairs in the world, end of quote. In this sense, the act of recognizing and singling out an item in the present as evidence of a past is, by its very nature, intentional. I argue that items always emerge as historical evidence in this intentional relationship. This phenomenological definition means that de facto there is no unintentional evidence. On the contrary, historians working on how testimonies are produced come across several different forms or degrees of intentionality. Oops. Firstly, identifying memorial intentionality. This refers to all representation of the past that are deliberately created to be passed on to the future, whether they are written, oral, visual, or material. A meaningful interpretations These representations are at the same time mediated and filtered, and therefore, in a certain sense, partisan and polarized histories. As Droysen wrote in his lectures on historic, they are neither objective facts nor the matter itself, but perceptions of facts. These intended representations entrusted to the future as offers of meaning are what I call monuments, commemorative things. Secondly, this memorial intentionality relates to the collection or production of evidence for use by future historians. Just think of the hundreds of new archives and collections dedicated to the COVID-19 pandemic and created in just 2 years. These are sources that have been selected and assembled to preserve this experience for the future. Remember the irony I mentioned at the beginning? Future historians may well use this pandemic evidence to investigate other issues, such as the history of consumerism, of social media, of national stereotypes, and mostly certainly questions that we simply cannot imagine from our vantage point in the present. Secondly, identify historiographical intentionality. If a memorial message mediated through the intended testimonies can be ignored or rejected, then these same testimonies can indeed be consciously reconsidered as sources of other past events or phenomena. The numerous monuments toppled during the French Revolution, for instance, were musealized and then resemanticized. Once perennial witnesses of the deeds of monarchs and prominent figures, these monuments were transformed into examples of how French taste and artistic styles evolved. It is precisely this endeavor to pose new and unexpected historical questions to memorial testimonies that is the real achievement of those involved in historical research, at least in Europe from the early modern period on. Here is not a matter of a memorial intentionality of those who produce testimonies, but of the historical question intentionally directed at the monuments, which, against their will, are interrogated as sources of other histories. So this intentionality is about the ability of historians to recognize traces of the past in present entities. As soon as an entity is perceived as a relic, a trace or survival of the past, the historian has already formed a relationship to it, which in phenomenological terms is intentional. In this sense, the historian has the power to select any existing entity, assemblage of entities, or material fragment through perception, to rescue it from the flow of time and to assign it the status of a trace of a particular past to which it bears witness. For this reason, traces, remains, ruins, or sources already conceptually reveal the existence of an observing subject capable of relating their presence to an absent past. Somewhere in this irreducible residue of intentionality lurks historicity. I argue that history begins in the relational moment when an entity or an assemblage of entities is considered to be about a particular past and consequently become a trace or metonymy of this past. And it's to these elementary particles of historicity, to history's point zero, that my research is devoted. In particular, I'm interested in the fine boundary where inorganic materiality is invested with historical testimonial value. So a first outline of a critique of intentionality and an initial attempt to identify this boundary is on our blog, Theory of History of Work. I'm doing some advertise. So my understanding departs from the classic definition of history that sees it, in the words of Coustel de Coulanges, où l'homme a passé, là où il a laissé quelques fables empreintes de sa vie et de son intelligence. Where a human being has passed, where he has left some pen imprint of his life and his intelligence. History is not where human beings have left traces. History, in my understanding, begins where human beings turn things into traces of a past. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for this very good talk as well, Lisa. I don't see, unfortunately, Carlos here. Yeah, so we shall begin to the Q&A sessions then. We have some people online and some people here. So who wants to start making questions so the panelists can answer? Someone can be the first. Yeah, okay, so Lisette will make her questions. I will just bring the microphone closer. Okay.
Hello, everybody. María Inés, hello to Argentina. María Inés, in your presentation, for me it was very important to notice that the radical feminism or the feminist movement in Argentina is not taken as a criminal one. That is the case now in Mexico. The criminalization of the feminist movement and of course the radical ones. So I would like to know about your opinion, because in your presentation you said nothing about it, but maybe it's also the case because in the last sentence, in the last part of the presentation, you clearly made a distinction between feminism and radical feminism. So it's something to do also with this kind of criminalization, or is not the case in Argentina or South America? Because here in Mexico it's clearly a great problem in order not to take into account the demands of the feminist movements.
Okay, before answering your question, Lisette, I want to thank you personally very much for the great effort that you have done with Ruiz and Berber in making possible this conference after a whole pandemic, and making us aware that this was going to be able to be done in some moments. So I wanted to congratulate and to thank you. And as you know, I'm very sad not to be there because I enjoy the dialogue with everybody for the past years in the conference. But well, this is something that is part of the post-pandemic, I hope, the post-pandemic time. In regard to your question, it's a very interesting question. I have several things to say. First, I was not aware that there is a criminalization of feminism in Mexico. Mexico has a very rich and long feminist tradition, but I didn't know that this was something of the moment. So I am taking notice of what you are saying, and I'm going to get to analyze that, because of course my claim has to also have in mind or bear in mind different contexts and geographies in Latin America and the world. But I would say that I'm sadly not surprised that there is a criminalization, because I think that, there has been several public discussions on what is now a backlash from right-wing parties or conservative parts of societies all around the world against the appearance or reappearance of feminism as a social movement. So on the one hand, there is something that is going on in Argentina since 2015, then with the Poland strike in 2016, and there was an expansion because there you have the international strikes that were articulated in different countries around the globe and with a very important impact in Latin America, Mexico, Brazil, etc. Even Chile, that has in 2018 a feminist May, the May as the month, Mayo. So there is something going on, and there has also been from the 70s on some advancement on legislation to ensure women's rights, LGBTQ plus people rights, like same-sex marriage or abortion laws or sexual reproductive rights legislation. And I think that we are witnessing now something that ties the issues that have to do with gender in a society or sexualities with the issues of the crisis of capitalism or the neoliberal phase of capitalism. And this has to do with a backlash that really sees in feminism a disruption of order of the status quo that is part of the crisis. So this is an argument to put the crisis in the hands of women and LGBTQ people when this is an economic crisis. It's a historical crisis of the mode of production. Yeah, and one is a crisis of the economical practices and the production of profit, and the other is a crisis of marginalized groups or subaltern groups that are saying we had enough, we need a rise, and they are getting more legislation in the national and international sphere. But I didn't know that there was a criminalization. I wouldn't say that there is one in Argentina. In fact, this all depends on how politics at the national level moves, of course. But since the 2015 feminist demand were so strong, everybody in the political arena had to present themselves as being allies of the feminist movement. And for example, the actual president, Alberto Fernandez, when he got into the presidency, he promised that the abortion law was going to be treated, and it was treated and passed. Macri did the same thing before Alberto Fernandez, but it also created, Alberto Fernandez, a ministry of women, gender, and sexual diversity. So in that sense, I would say that in a good and in a strategic sense, the feminist agenda is an agenda that has such a strong place in the public sphere that everybody has to be saying that they do something in favor of women or LGBTQ people. But on the other side, regarding radical feminism, there are several different ways of understanding radical feminism. There is a way of understanding it in the 70s, and there are now other ways of calling radical feminism. And I don't know if in Mexico, which will be the way that in Mexico is said. But what I would say is that there is no criminalization, but there were certain situations where after a massive protest, the police would take one or two feminists, or there is always, when there is a protest and there is some painting in the walls, the police comes like to settle order, but I wouldn't say that there is a criminalization. But this is maybe the context in Argentina. I will check up the context in Mexico. Thank you for the observation, Lisette.
Yeah, thank you very much. Do you want to follow up? Okay. Thank you very much, for María Inés, for your answer. I see Lisa Regazzoni has raised her hands. I forgot to mention if someone else online also wants to make a question, please raise your hands too. So Lisa.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Jesus, and thank you, Maria, for your inspiring talks. I have a question to Maria. I agree absolutely with you that manifestation can be an occasion of challenging narratives and so on. I was wondering, because what is the relationship to history of these groups? Because I was thinking it's a very important question about how we think collective subjects. And from the very 70th century on, in the logic, actually is a question of linguistic philosophy. And the question is, you can imagine, rather you imagine a performative group of people, they come together, a performative assemblage at the moment of the manifestation, but that can try to change history, but in the very moment when they come together and then they go to different ways, they're different ways. So you don't have a very continuity of the collective. So they need history. And that's the very important question in Thompson and the Marxian tradition, that subject of history have to be, needs actually a history to be a collective who is able to act. So my question is, because you have women and other groups which have the oar on history, and they need a history of discrimination, a history of misabuse to be able to advance their requests and so on. And my question is, how do you deal with the histories they bring with them to pose questions, to challenge the society and so on? Because they need history to be subject. Otherwise, they are performative assemblage.
Well, Lisa, very interesting question. I'm going to answer some things, but I think it's a long discussion. I hope we have more time. It depends on what you mean by history. What does it mean that somebody needs a history? Because it could be that somebody needs a powerful narrative that configures a notion of a common past. And in that sense, the problem, it is really interesting, the different levels of the notion of history that are at work in this problem. Of course, as you say, there is a need for history. I would claim that some of the activism related, there is an ambivalent relationship with having a history, because we are talking about groups that were denied a history of their own in the conventional, hegemonic, or even historiographical narrative of who is the subject of history, or who is the human, or who is really human in our Western society. So you know that feminist history, LGBTQ history, or studies, they point toward their invisibilization, their being erased. Also, I was thinking about this when you were presenting your paper, because I understand what you mean by intentionality, but who is the knower? That was a very important point for feminist, gender, queer studies. Who is the one knowing, and how is that intentionality historically situated? So for a long period of modern historiography, women were not, the remains of women's action were not relevant because women weren't relevant for history. So then there is a very ambivalent and tense idea of what to have a history means. I will say that a lot of groups, one of the important things they want or they do is to narrate their own history against academia or challenging academic notion or conventional notions. For example, if you move the issue not to gender or sexuality issues, but to racialized people or indigenous people, the national narratives in Latin America that are an invention of post-colonial society, I mean, of colonial societies to invent the idea of Argentine people, well, they were left out of those narratives. So they don't have a history, that, I mean, this is a tricky point. So in the one hand, you could say, well, Argentinian people have a history and they are a nation state or a nation. We are quite an invention. And the narrative was the narrative of a certain hegemonic group in Argentina that wanted to portray themselves as more closely related to Europe than to their own histories, real histories, we would say, or indigenous history. And also part of the consolidation of the national state in Argentina, as in other places in Latin America, had to do with literally eliminating the indigenous people, not just taking them out of the narrative, but taking them out of their place. There is something in Argentina called Campaña del Desierto, the desert campaign, that was the name of the genocide of indigenous people, and the name means the campaign to the desert. So the metaphor that where those people were, it was a desert, is a beautiful one. So what I mean with all these examples is that I think that it is still a problem what it is to have a history and to have a collective that doesn't go each way, or that is not just a spontaneous movement. So I agree with you. And I think in this sense, it is a very interesting thing to read this feminist 99% manifesto with the Marx and Engels manifesto, because there you see the change in subjectivity. The 99% manifesto that is being written from a feminist point of view, but an anti-capitalist aim, and they are trying to do with Marx and Engels still, but now they cannot take for granted an homogeneous notion of class. So the question you ask is the problem and the phenomenon to be analyzed. In that sense, what I would say, just to end up my answer, is that I don't think that the performative aspect of the assembly is something that is a problem, but something that is a symptom of our times. But well, again, we need another conference to follow the discussion. Thank you, Lisa, for your question.
So, yeah, okay. So thank you very much for your answer as well, Maria Inés. Someone else wants to make a question, do a question here inside. Okay, I don't see any. Well, me, I have some questions to make. Maybe in the meantime, someone else also, you want to add something, Lisette, of course, go ahead. Please bring the microphone for Lisette first. Yes, yes, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. So, thank you, Lisa, also for your presentation. And I don't know if you can present a little bit more the blog about theory of history at work, because I think that is very important. And I remember that was also an objective not to present this blog here in the conference. And of course, I think that there is an invitation for all of us to participate in this blog, no? Ban. So maybe very, very spontaneously you can present this blog, because I think that is something very, very important.
Yes, indeed. Thank you very much. Lisa, please.
Thank you so much. For all the organization is amazing. And I'm really thrilled to be here. And I don't want to take the stage. I mean, if you have another question, or you can interrupt me if you have other questions. And thank you to Maria to your answer. I think it's a question I'm really obsessed, and because it's interesting that they read Marx but not Thompson, who precisely criticized Marx for the very stable notion of class and trying to think the historicity and how as a subject, the historical subject emerged in history. So it would be much more interesting if they would read Thompson than Marx. But so the blog. I wasn't prepared, and I tried to share the screen. So that is the blog, and I'm very happy that we have here our editorial assistant, Markus Wistup, who is student in Bielefeld, and I can see him in the audience, in the digital audience. The idea of the blog was at the very beginning to try to rethink, if you want, theory of history, not as a question or a canon of question, not as canon of authors, not as discipline who is written and read by philosophers, but really to think we all are reflecting on history and how to write history and what is history in an epistemological sense of the term, ontological sense of the term, and it was a try to collect different opinions and different reflections about history, and not necessarily done by philosophers or the classical authors. And the second important aim was to, if you want, a little to break the Anglo-Saxon dominance in the field. And because I'm Italian and I worked a lot in France, and now I'm German, I was really interesting to reconsider other ways of thinking about history from different national and world perspective. And because of that, we have a blog, which is in 4 languages. Obviously, because we are based in Germany, the most of the contacts or people are more willing, unfortunately, to write are German people. And at the very beginning, we tried to translate some blog posts or people wrote their posts in German and French and English in 2 languages. But we are very willing to save and to pursue a multilingualism. I can read Spanish. I studied Spanish at the university, but I'm not able to edit Spanish, and that's the problem. That we are trying to publish in languages we can really edit. And at least the first section, which is maybe the heart of the, that's an old graphic, we are changing the graphic, it would be much more attractive, I hope, in 2 weeks. But the core or the very heart of our blog at the very beginning was Geschichtstheorie polyphon, theory of history polyphonic, and Ethan Kleinberg wrote the first post, and it was really the idea to ask to different people, and not only in a very close network, to ask, what do you think? What is theory of history? What is, in my opinion, which is much more interesting, theorize or theorizing history? I really insist on the verb, because it's the reflection activity I'm interested in. I'm interested in the question and not in a set of theories or closed theory we have to apply. And that's another important aspect, because I'm between philosophy and history. On one side, you have philosophers maybe with not a great understanding how historians works. And I mean, evidence, they don't exist. You have really to construct your evidence, to find your evidence, and they don't say the most of the time anything about history. You have to read in a very indirect way and to combine different evidence. So it was a try to bring philosophers and theorists with historians in conversation, and to try to present historians interesting theoretical reflections. And in this section, we have historians, we have philosophers, we have theorists, we have sociologists, and anybody is very welcome to think about why is important theory of history and what is its aim, and we have a description, and then we extended the block to 4 to 3 hour categories. Theory of history in media. So history without media doesn't exist. So it's the way how media shapes history and dictated a way of thinking, and not only narrations, but maybe images or the digital media and so on. Then we have the third section, theory of history reread, and that's a try to not only to write about works or comment or review of book in theory of history on related topics, but is a way maybe to reconsider authors that which didn't or don't are considered as canonical authors, but have interesting aspects in relating to theoretical questions. And then a fourth section, theory of history wide open. Geschichtstheorie ins Offene. We have to play a lot with the translation of this title, and this is the idea to have a space for maybe much more original, not necessarily close reflection in actually in work in progress, and maybe much more fragmentary, but worth of be written and be read. And on the page, I tried, you have to stop me, but in any case, we have the style sheets, how to contribute. Every post is read by 2 people, and normally we do a lot of suggestions or some suggestions. So it's not only we talk all the things, and we try to relate the different posts through keywords, but through different issues. We have something about das umstrittene Wir, the question of collective identities, of collective subjects, and we are thinking on different tools, something like how to get much more commentaries. But we were very successful in some blogs, and actually about the collective identities, we had a lot of commentaries. And so I think that's all. And we have a Twitter account, so you can follow us, and you are very welcome to participate in. And it's really a place to shape our idea and to negotiate our idea of theory of history, and it's very open. But you are the people who can actually create and shape this place. So I'm very, I hope that people participate in because differently we have only some positions, or so thank you.
Thank you very much for presenting this very nice initiative. Congratulations for the initiative of the blog as well. So everyone is invited to access it. I think Hugo has a question.
I do, yes.
Yeah, go ahead, please.
Turn the microphone. I believe you hear me well anyway.
Yeah.
Hello, hi. Thank you very much for the presentation. Thank you, María Inés and Lisa. It was a pleasure to hear you all. Especially after listening to Jesus and María Inés' presentations. When I was listening to Lisa's presentation, I started to think, and this is the question, how intentionality relates to agency. And do you believe, or sorry, what do you believe is the importance of a critique of material sources to some of the contemporary discussions in theory of history. And I would mention here like peripheral historical thinking, different modes of thinking historically, decoloniality. I would even say like subaltern history as one of these topics in which I find intentionality and why not agency something to be particularly interesting. And also human, non-human approaches to history, Anthropocene, all these questions. So, yeah, I don't know if I made myself clear.
It's an amazing question, and I would say I'm searching for answers, and at least is an intertwined topic because I worked a lot on antiquarianism and how antiquarian consider, at a certain time, piece of stone considered a natural apparition. At a certain time, they became testimonies of history, of humankind. So, and I began to reflect about why at a certain point we consider something as a bearer of historicity or of information of the past and not other traces. And I could reconstruct the processes in which what I spoke about, the discover of an open past, and that's another topic. I have an historical focusing, and I worked a lot on material traces, for instance, related to the question of antiquarianism. And then I've been working for 10 years with scientific collections at the university, Goethe University. So, and the question of epistemic objects, how science create the other objects of research. And then at the same time, I worked a lot on theory of materiality. And of course, and I'm really interested, I see Eva Domanska here, because the question of objects and subalternities and agency is very intertwined. And I'm really struggling with the new materialism and the question of agency. And in the debate about things of history, or it's very close to Latour, who repeated at least Heidegger in his analysis on objects, and the idea when and why objects come into the perception. And I find very difficult this way to approach objects if we want to consider objects as historical sources. So in my, so I abandoned in a certain way the idea of agency, and I did a step back from Heidegger to at least Husserl. And I think Husserl is much more interesting and helpful in understanding how our relationship as historians to material sources and these intentional moments of recognizing something as bearer of historical information. And I don't deny that, I don't know, the glass has in its own information and a lipstick and water and molecules and so on. But as long as away from my way of thinking and seeing, it's not an historical object. So it's interesting for philosophy and the question of what is reality. So I could perfectly work with Latour and with the idea of agency. In sociology, I think it's perfect, and the idea of assemblage is very much important in my work. But if I think about something, it's no more anymore there, and then I prefer to work with the idea of intentionality in a very Husserlian way. So I hope, but it's a long discussion because I'm very looking for, and I'm searching, and yes.
Thank you very much, Lisa, for your answer. Does anyone have other questions? We have some minutes left. Because I do have, although Lisa has just anticipated my question, I was indeed thinking to ask you what your thoughts on the relation with this notion of intentionality with the phenomenological tradition. It's a very core concept for phenomenology, and you just kind of pointed to it with mentioning Husserl and so on. I have a very small remark. It's more like a commentary than a question to Jesus, because I really love. Okay, it seems like you're starting to think more deeply about these issues of the time of crisis and how can we write different modes of temporality in our world, thinking from a non-Eurocentric point of view, right? So it is indeed very important to consider how, let's say, the third world, so to say, right, can do theory. Because there is indeed a sort of intellectual division of labor, so to say, right? Only some of places in the world are able to do theory, whereas others, they do more like empirical research and this kind of stuff. So yeah, I would indeed invest in this idea of thinking theoretically from Latin America and the experiences people live in Latin America, not as a way to apply theories, but as a way to construct new theories as well. So yeah, congratulations for your work. Yes, and to María Inés, I really love your presentation today, and it touches on some of my research interests as well, especially with this use of Manifesto as a historical media, so to say. Because your presentation, as far as I could understand, revolves around the question of what mediating history means. And then I was thinking also of what kind of media these historic mediators use. And I think you rightly point to the Manifesto as a very well-suited media, history media, for times lived as troubled or critical. And I was thinking regarding to the use of Manifesto as a new, or not new, right, but as a typical media for these social activists in order to do history, not only to represent history, but in order to perform historical action. Now, it seems to me that I'm not sure if I'm correct here, but it seems to me that there is a tension between the narrative, or at least the traditional notion of narrative that we have, especially regarding the way that narrative can represent time in a sequential, continuous time, mostly, and the Manifesto, whose temporality seems to point not to this kind of sequential continuous time, but as to rather disruptive time, the time of the now, or the kairos time, if you want. So it seems to me that there is a tension that I'm not sure, but maybe this is what Lisa also touches in her question. Because indeed it is very important to consider the role of history in creating this sort of continuity in order to create a more, let's say, stable identity that can indeed act and have whose action can have more deep consequences, so to say. But as you rightly point, and I agree with you in your response, considering that the main or traditional historical view does not take into account or marginalize, so to say, women or these new types of naming these subjects, right? That you pointed out on your presentation as well. So there seems to be a need to disrupt this, traditional view of, or indeed to represent history, not insisting on the continuous view of history, but rather insisting on this necessity to disrupt, the idea of rupture seems to be central. So I don't know if I'm making myself clear in this question, but please, could you just share some thoughts if you have?
Yes, I think that you have very interesting points regarding this, the role of the manifesto, of the mediation, of the continuity, of the disruption. I think that one of the big discussions in the 20th century has been whether history is continuity or discontinuity. Mm-hmm. One of the idea that history is continuity is the modern concept of history that has come to a crisis in the 20th century in several ways. One of those ways is the appearance of subjectivities that were not considered the subject of history. No, the idea that the human being in reality was a specific kind of social group and not everybody. So our very notion of humanity, I think, is already being challenged. And I remember discussing this in the YouTube interview we had during the pandemic. I think that it is interesting to try to analyze what level of continuity is needed and what level of discontinuity is level. In the following sense, the manifesto is also a modern kind of action that has to do with the revolution, or even the artistic manifestos, the idea of changing or disrupting. That what I try to show in my presentation is that the manifesto has a narrative. That's why I propose that we can think that the manifesto is creating, but in a cognitive, responsible way. So you cannot say that it's merely ideological or mere invention. A narrative of why we are here now. So why are we, if we believe or we accept the ideas presented in the manifesto, why are we now in a specific kind of crisis of capitalism? And in that sense, you can dispute that feminism all around the globe thinks that the issue is capitalism. For example, this is an US written manifesto, and in Latin America, you don't necessarily have this polarization between left and right, or between left and capitalism, or the other thing. Also, what is an anti-capitalist struggle? It is so defined to be against capitalism that is socialism, but in what sense? So there are a lot of things to analyze, but to get back to the point you are showing, I think that there is a continuity that is being affirmed. And that continuity has to do with saying that for the past 4 decades, the specific phase of capitalism we're in affects specifically certain groups. Those certain groups has been those groups defined by being a mere resource or body, instead of the mind of the human subject. So there is something interesting. On the other hand, of course, there is a explicit presentation of this narrative as an argument to analyze the present, to disrupt the present. But on the other hand, the idea of social movements as history mediators is not that the manifesto is the social mediation, but the social movement thinking the disruption and writing. That is why I wanted to show that the full-blown narrative, you can find it there, but you can also see it in other publications or discussions in international feminism. But that is one full narrative that is being presented in order to argue for an anti-capitalist alliance. But feminism has broader discussion. So in that sense, I would say that the narrative is not the mediation, but the movement of changing history in both sense. The occurrences, the development of occurrences, and the story would tell about it. So thank you very much. There's a lot to keep on talking, but I don't want to take my time.
No. Thank you very much for your clear answer. I don't know if anyone else has more questions to make. I see Lisa. Yes, go ahead, Lisa, please.
Sorry, if you are not other question, I would really insist on the question of history and collective subjects, because I was thinking about the Marxism and and how the subjects can become not only the subject of a history, but the makers of a history, which in a perspective of philosophy of history is the history of their progress, their realization, I think the proletariat, and their dictatorship. So in this perspective, the necessity of history is because of logic, the philosophical logic of history. And it's interesting in a lot of discussions, I mean, in historical context about collective, they actually are very bounded with the Marxian tradition. But I was wondering, and I was thinking, okay, but what is history good for? Because in a philosophical way of thinking history, the proletarians needs history and needs to produce history and need to become aware of history. Otherwise, they cannot be the subject of history. But in a modern world, without philosophy of history, without the end of history, without the idea of emancipatory progress, why is history important, or what is history good for?
I don't know if the question is for everybody to discuss. I would say that, again, my answer is a little bit repetitive because I think that what is history is at stake. And I think that the feminist and queer reflection of the past decade has reimagined agency without progressive linearity. The thing is that for us, it's very difficult to consider that we are talking about history without progressive linearity. But, well, it's not so difficult being people from the 20th century. We have the identity problem of what it means to be historical when there is no more logic or progress or happiness or communism that is going to let us be free of every oppression. So this movement, these social movements are quite aware that these logics, these promises are not there. And I think that that's, again, an argument in favor of thinking of how is the notion of history and the subject of history being mediated. And in that sense, my point in the presentation was to show that, this is what I'm trying to think in the past years, that there is a particular, if you are redefining history, you are redefining humanity, because both concepts have been established as the same. The creation of man in the humanities and the notion of history as progressive are one and the same, and Marxism has been a humanism, and this has been a criticism within both Marxist thinkers. So I think that we are in a moment of shifting between inherited ideas that are cultural specific ideas. Our notion of history is not a universal notion of history. We know that it was a concept and a way of understanding humanity, that it was the historical emergence of a century and an European hegemonic framework. But we ourselves try to understand that we are in a historical mode of being that cannot be cannot be thought with the same in the same way. That, for example, you have this discussion of presentism and the modern regime of history and problems with time, and is time out of joint, and what is temporality? So all this discussion for me have to do with a moment of debate, I would say, at least in the humanities, the social sciences, and with a relationship with social movements, where we are trying to redefine, and the problem is, as I try to show, that we are very much aware that we cannot present a unique, homogeneous, universal subject. But then there is something going on, and there is historical change. Feminism, LGBTQ protests claim to be doing a revolution. What is this, the revolution that doesn't have an emancipatory telos or aim as a secure logic? So I'm sorry, Lisa, but I am also answering your question with more question, because I think that the problem is what we are trying to elucidate. If we don't get committed with, I wouldn't say old, by previous or inherited ways of understanding history.
I don't know if you want to follow up, Lisa, or are you contemplating?
Thank you so much. I'm very interested in how it will change our understanding of history. And when I think history is obviously a meaningful representation or narration of the past, whatever it is. And I was wondering, because history in the past has always legitimated every collective. So, and really interesting in the changing of the function of history and the definition of history, because actually the departure from Marxism, but it's not a definitive departure. So it's very interesting to observe.
Just a comment. One of the things that is interesting to analyze, but just to leave it open, is the fruitful alliance that feminist theory, queer theory, trans studies have done with post-structuralism, and mainly genealogy as a way of thinking history. Because genealogy, if we consider Foucault's famous text on Nietzsche history and genealogy, genealogy is not the end of history. It's another concept of history. And there it is, you have the idea in genealogy that history is a series of interpretation where there is the struggle between the dominated and the dominees, but there is no progressive, linear, metaphysical point of view that Foucault would consider that Marxism or modern concept of history has. And then you have something to think about. Why is genealogy so interesting for these groups? And it's a way of claiming that the present is historical in the sense that it could be otherwise. Why is the focus on contingency so interesting for these groups instead of the concept of a logic that is necessary, or this continuity against continuity? So I think that you can map a lot of interesting things, and I am sorry again that we have limited time and that we cannot go to the coffee break to continue the discussion.
The very problem of Foucault was the changing, actually, how to think about change. He couldn't with the genealogy, and that's the interesting thing, because I think, yeah, but sorry, we don't, yeah. I very miss the coffee pause with you.
Yes, we are. Well, we have only 5 minutes, but that we could spend much more time in discussing this stuff. Foucault, for example, it's glad that María Inés remembered Foucault, this idea of genealogy as a critique of the origins, and how central is this idea of discontinuity for him, this idea of unmasking identity rather than creating an essentialist view of identity. So we will have much things to discuss, But I'm glad that we have a good discussion today. I think we could, yeah, unless anyone else here wants to add something else. So yeah, I declare the session today finished, so we can have a coffee break today. Thank you very much, Maria Inés, Lisa, and
Thank you.
Jesus, for your presentation. Yes, and you just follow the program, and we have plenty of other panels. Thank you so much.
Have a nice time in the conference.
Okay,
Bye.
thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Maria?
Yeah.
Yeah, just a second. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you, Lisa. I didn't know that you were part of the hypothesis blog because